Hey everyone, in this presentation I just want to talk about Paul Diehl's paper, Diehl 83 as we call it, but obviously the full citations there, Arms Races and Escalation, a closer look. Now, just to start off, some style comments. This paper is very much done in the what most of us consider the normal style. It is a bit confounding that different journals have different styles. And so as we go through the course and as you go through the program, you're going to, download papers that have just basically, different formats, and, some will have most will have abstracts, some won't. You'll find those are very annoying. Some will have author date citations in the text like this one. Others won't, and you'll find that annoying as well eventually. But this is more like it. Okay, is the key thing. And so I just that helps. I do want to quickly note the acknowledgments in the first page of this. In the lower corner there are acknowledgments, and those are not trivial, right? Those are actually part of academic integrity. And so when you have contributions that are general, that have helped you, but you can't, put a citation or a particular footnote in the paper, you use acknowledgments for that. That's something that is important to note. But more important is the literature review in this. And one of the things that this is a good example of is how research comes out of previous research. And the paper is written in a way that just, very heavily focuses, in this case, on one particular article, Wallace's article, work on arms races. But that's okay. I mean, that's the state of the art. That was the one person who really took a look at it, and Diehl is now looking at it. And were you to do a paper about arms races today, you would say, well, there's Wallace, there's Diehl, a couple more papers by Diehl on this subject, and then there's one by Jim Morrow, right? And that's the literature on this particular issue, because honestly hasn't been looked at that much. Although arms races, the idea that arms races cause war is, out there and has been kind of prevalent. So my point is, from page 205 to 207, you essentially have a literature review. That is a lit review. It goes into the literature, into the previous scholarship. It critically examines it and discovers an opportunity to do something to make it better, right? That's what a lit review is about and how it functionally fits. Notice that when done properly, it's a seamless part of the narrative. It isn't a section literature review, right? It's not clunky like that. And so you might not notice it being a lit review, but it is. So that's a very important point to make here. Now, variables. The other thing that this does that is a good exemplar of social science is it focuses on the role of variables, right? And we basically have something we're trying to explain, whether or not war occurs. That's the dependent variable. And in this article, we're looking at whether or not arms races lead to war. And so arms races are the independent variable. And we have out there a reason to think, and if you go to Wallace's article, there's a lot more discussion of the historical case where historians talked about arms races and how, World War I, Congress actually had a study that concluded that the arms race prior to World War I helped cause the war. So this idea is out there. And the question is, does this hold water? And so we're trying, and this is the key thing. We're trying to see the relationship of one thing on another, right? And that's what social science is about. Looking at that, we don't have to limit ourselves to one. There can be multiple causality, but this is the idea: trying to tease out the relationship between one phenomena and another in the world is very much what we're about. Also, as we're going to see, testing it, seeing whether or not the data supports the idea that, because there's inevitably there's the idea that, or we have ideas about the relationship between variables. We start with those. Those are theories. Those are explanations of the world. They might start out with hunches, but a theory tells a causal story. So and then a theory leads to a hypothesis. If that's right, then we should see this happening in the world. A hypothesis is a predicted empirical relationship or correlation, and we then go test them, right? And so the testing is also a very important thing. How do we test things? Well, in this case, this paper has something called crosstabs in it. And crosstabs are really kind of a pithy little thing. It's a table, right? You might want to call it a matrix, perhaps, but it's a crosstab. And and what is a crosstab? Well, it's a table in which the cases, you have a data set, right? You have a sample, or perhaps you have the population, right? When you have every one of them, you either have a sample if you have some, or you have the population of events, right? If you have all of them, but that's your data set, right? And you have a certain number of examples, that's n, right? And you're looking at that, right? These are your events, these are your observations, right? That's what we call each event, and you have so many of them, right? That's n. And what you do is you sort them, and in the columns you sort on the dependent variable, war or no war, and in the rows you sort by the independent variable, arms race, no arms race. And you're able to look at this, right? And I say it's a visual representation of data sorted by dependent and independent variables. So the key thing about it is, because it's visual, you can eyeball it, right? We can look at this and get a sense of what's going on without having to actually do any math, right? And this is, in table 1, Diehl is recreating Wallace's arms races and escalation data, right? And he's showing what, he's basically saying, okay, here's what Wallace found. And so just to look at it, right, if you look at it and you say, all right, well, in the first row, we have all the cases with arms races. And we see, wow, 23 of them resulted in war, but only 5 had no war. And then we go to the next row and we say, well, when there was no arms race, wow, there were only 3 wars and 68 not wars. Wow, that seems to, that tells a story, right? You don't need to do math, right? You can just eyeball that and see there's weight. And if you want some better words for it, there's weight on the diagonals, right? Fancy way of saying it, but there's more weight on the diagonals. And whenever you have more weight on one diagonal than another, you've got, you've got a correlation, basically, which might be the result of some relationship between these things, but we can't be sure. Correlation is not causality. Keep that in mind. Okay, on the bottom row, we got statistics, and you can do statistics with crosstabs. And Yule's Q gives you the direction and strength of the relationship, right? And it's a 0, it's a -1 to 1, right? So 1 is 100, like 100. So this 98 is a very strong relationship, positive relationship. It's a number. I don't know, it hasn't necessarily added anything to our eyeballing of the data. The significance, right? This is another thing you see a lot of, and chi-squared, and that's that little funny looking X, is actually a Greek chi. And sometimes people just spell it out CHI squared, and I do because I can't be bothered to find the Greek letter in the word processor. But that is a measure of significance, and it basically says, what are the odds that this relationship, that what we're seeing, could have occurred randomly, right? Given the number of observations and the prevalence of war, no war, and arms race, no arms race, what are the odds that if we just randomly, if sorting on the rows was just random, it had no relation, it's just, what are the odds we could see this? And it turns out the odds are low, right? A high chi-squared suggests that the odds are low, which means they're statistically significant. So that is a crosstab, right? And that, there you go. There's a simple thing. And this is how we test things. This is how we look at it. And I'm calling it a test, but, we have a proposition that there's a relationship between war and no war. Well, I mean, arms races and war. Well, if there is one, we should see something like this, right? And this is a support. This is supporting right? This is, something that would suggest a relationship. Technically, when you get into statistics, you'll say, well, what you have is you reject the null hypothesis that there is no relationship between arms races and wars. I mean, technically, we go there, but I think you get the idea. Key thing, we're going to the empirical world, testing the proposition. Okay, Diehl, his paper basically says, all right, Wallace's analysis has problems. Right? That's basically what this is, and this is a short paper, and it's not a big one, right? This is kind of a minor paper, almost a research note, but a good one. And in some ways, it's nice because it is using crosstabs. I hope I've explained it well. You can now see where it's coming from. He explains a lot of the data issues that he has, some of the things he's questioning about Wallace, most notably that when Wallace counts observations, he used dyads, he used pairs of nations. And so in a war with a bunch of people, right, if you had two people on one side and two people on the other side, well, he's looking at dyads. And so, that one war with just two people on either side, well, there's 4 different pairings that could come out of that, right, from one side to the other, and that would count for 4 wars. And in fact, like World War, he says that 6 or 7 wars become 27 in his data set. And so he has, he questions that. He also questions how he measures whether arms races occurred or not. And Diehl actually says, well, the term arms race is a little subjective. Let's talk about a mutual military buildup, right? And so he measures the independent variable in a different way. And so he does different stuff with the data, and he explains all that. And I'll leave that to you to read. And I think he kind of explains it pretty well. I think it's not too arcane. But then he comes up, he says, well, here's what I get. When I do all this, this is what I get. What I get is, nothing. I mean, when you look at this crosstab, right, mutual military buildup, well, there were 3 wars and 9 no wars. Wow, right, very different result. And then, in general, a lot less war going on. And you just look at this and you say, well, I don't see a relationship. And in fact, there isn't one. There isn't a strong one, and the chi-squared is very low. This could easily happen by randomness. So technically, when we get into it, we cannot reject the null hypothesis that there is no relationship. In fact, we have to keep going with the null hypothesis, which comes in later. But I think you can just look at this. Forget the bottom row. Just look at that sorting of the data, that table. That tells the story. And pithy little, and he does some other stuff in the paper, but right now, a big pinprick in the balloon of arms races cause war, right? Okay, the key points. Like I say, this paper is more like it. This is an example of things we do. Key things to note: builds on the previous work, right? So it engages in what is the standard in the discipline, and you may find it tedious, right? Not to say that this is great. Right? The Waltz paper, which doesn't conform to this at all, to this pattern, is more like a Waltz opinion piece. But nevertheless, it might be more interesting to read. I don't know. But it builds on previous work. It says, all right, here's what Wallace did, and this is the state of the art on this, and there's some problems with it, and I'm going to fix them. Right? So it builds on it, goes farther than it, tests the relationship between 2 variables, right? We have this idea. We We have something we're trying to explain. That's the dependent variable. And then we have the thing we think explains it or has an effect on it. We tell a causal story. And so, and theories do that. Theories tell a causal story, right? This is not a theoretical paper. This is an empirical paper. But there's a theory out there that arms races cause war, right? It may be informal. It may be kind of a folk thing. We call folk things folk when they're just talked about. Or it, there have been other, there are other pieces. And in fact, if you get Wallace's paper, you'll find that he has tells you amongst historians where this idea came from. But based on these ideas about the relationship of these things, we go and we test them, right? This is what's so important. Social science is not a debate. It is not a pluralistic, in some ways, it's not this thing where we all have different perspectives and they're all equally valid. No, we test. You have a proposition about the world, and you test it. And if we falsify it, if the data doesn't support it, and we can falsify the ideas. We never prove anything, right? But we can falsify them. And so, that's a key thing. It's a subtle difference, but an important one. We are agnostic about our propositions. We like to test them. We use data, right? So we have this empirical stuff, and this is, to be honest, I'm a theorist, right? I didn't test my proposition. I had theories. I'm a doctor because I did a theoretical model of international economic sanctions. Okay, but that's that's the starting part. Eventually, you get empirical. You test things. So the key thing is we use the data and we look at the world. And what is data, right? It's when we systematically observe something across multiple events. We start calling it data. And here's the thing. We look at things in a systematic fashion across events. And we try to get the population. We try not to say arms races cause war because World War I occurred, and look at this case. It seems to show. And, we get, because World War I was big, ugly, and messy, we focus on it more than we might focus on, say, the Boer War. And there you go. Or all the other wars that have occurred, right? And the key thing is, and also the other thing is we need variation. We need to not just look at when wars occur, we need to look at when they don't occur. If you want to say that something causes war, you can't just look at cases in which war occurred. You have to look at disputes. So you have variation, right? And so these are the things, right? We're being cross-sectional. That's the last point. We're looking at instances of disputes in the data set to get a broad view to try to see if there's a general trend. This is very much the kind of thing we do, right? So this is a great example. This is honestly a paper that could be in the realm of what you could do as a capstone. It would be a very good one. But it's limited, it's doable. And I mean, you're going to be exposed to papers throughout the program that are much more involved, have much more sophisticated methods in them, and they are intimidating, right? So one thing about this thing from 1983 is I think it's a little less intimidating. You might find it, but believe me, if you come back to it after a few courses, you'll be like, oh yeah, this is kind of simple. But it's a good exemplar, right? If you want to know what you would have to do, if it was a capstone paper, we would probably actually want a little bit more discussion of the literature before Wallace, to be honest with you. In this case, I think they were, editing down. They wanted it in 7 pages, right? So that would be a difference. But otherwise, this is more what we're looking for. So, and it is doable. You also don't have to be quantitative. I don't want to scare anyone. You don't have to be. We do a lot of case studies, so there is that as well. But this is much more about what political science and international relations is about.